Hello, you're watching BBC News. We welcome viewers on BBC One and BBC World News as we expect today's coronavirus government briefing from Downing Street. It will start very shortly. I'm keeping an eye on the doors of Downing Street as we speak. It'll be led today by the Culture, Media and Sport Secretary, Oliver Dowden, and Professor Jonathan Van Tam, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer for England. Let's bring in now our health correspondent, Catherine Burns. Quick few headlines of what we might expect then in today's briefing.
I think the interesting thing today is going to be seeing what the scientists say, because we've had the government starting to bring in some levels of us opening up. And also we've seen in the last day or so a little bit of controversy about that. We've seen scientists from SAGE, which is the group that advises the government, saying this is too much too soon. So it's going to be very interesting to see what questions are asked about that, why this is happening right now.
And particularly so as the government has been so keen to say we are following the science, and if there appears to be dissent in the ranks now, this could cause potentially a problem because the unions are already looking to this. Actually, we're going to go straight to Downing Street now to hear more. Jonathan Van Tam and Oliver Dowden.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the afternoon Downing Street briefing. Let me begin, as usual, with the latest figures. 4,171,408 tests for coronavirus have now been carried out in the United Kingdom. That includes 120 yesterday. 272,826 people have tested positive. That is an increase of 2,445 cases since yesterday. And sadly, of those tested positive for coronavirus across all settings, 38,376 have now died. That's an increase of 215 fatalities since yesterday. This new figure includes deaths in all settings, not just in hospitals. And of course, every one of those deaths is a tragedy for the family involved, and our thoughts are with all of them. Now, as the Chancellor outlined yesterday, those numbers show we are now past the peak. And as we continue to flatten the curve, we are able to start reopening parts of the economy. We are also looking at how to begin relaxing other measures so that we can re-establish some normality in other parts of our lives. Which brings me to something which many people have been eagerly awaiting news about, and that's the return of live sport. Now, for more than 2 months after sport stopped, and after weeks of round-the-clock discussions with medical experts and professional sports bodies, I'm delighted to announce today that the government has published guidance which allows competitive sport to resume behind closed doors from Monday at the earliest, and crucially, only when it's safe to do so. It's up to each individual sport to decide exactly when to resume competition. They know their sports best. But football, tennis, horse racing, Formula One, cricket, golf, rugby, snooker and others are all set to return to our screens shortly, with horse racing first out of the gate in the North East next week. It's been a huge challenge to get to this point. We've taken a forensic, clinician-led approach, working with Public Health England and the Department of Health every step along the way. And we've had dozens of meetings and published pages of detailed guidance outlining first how to get athletes back into socially distanced training and then back into close contact training. And throughout all of this, we've put the safety of the athletes, coaches and support staff first and foremost. And by working so closely with the sports themselves, we've made sure that it's been a collaborative, consensual effort to create the safest possible environments for everyone involved. Now, the guidance outlines various measures that need to be in place for an event to go ahead and to keep everyone involved safe. That includes a screening process for coronavirus symptoms at the venue, a one-way system for people and vehicles, minimising the use of dressing rooms, and of course maintaining social distancing wherever that is possible. And as all sports fully recognise, ensuring the mental health of their athletes and staff is as important as their physical health, particularly in these very difficult times, and our guidance today reinforces that. It's taken a lot of hard work to get us here today, so thank you to everyone involved, and I know that this will be welcome news for many. Now, of course, much of the media attention has focused on football because it has that special place in our national life. And recognising its significance, I set 2 challenges for football's return. First, that a reasonable number of remaining Premier League games would be broadcast free to air, and second, that the financial benefits of returning would be shared throughout the entire football family. So I'm glad to confirm today that a third of matches to finish the season will now be free to view, including the Liverpool versus Everton derby, and live Premier League football will be on the BBC for the first time in its history. This is an open invitation for all fans to be part of this significant moment in our sporting history. And it also, of course, has the really serious public health benefit of encouraging people to watch at home, which will be essential. Now, getting top leagues back up and running will also release much needed funding to support clubs lower down, many of whom are cornerstones of their local communities. And with both of these benefits, I can now make it official: football is coming back. Of course, these headline sporting events are only one part of the story, and I really am keenly aware that even as we reopen some domestic competitive fixtures, not all events will be back on. And given the deserved momentum that had built up behind women's sport after football, cricket and netball World Cups, I will be working hard with the Sports Minister to make sure we don't lose any of that progress. Visibility matters, and our daughters deserve to see female athletes on the main stage. Now, our focus is also on how we can get grassroots sports back up and running safely so that people can reunite with their local teammates. Now, while those teams can't compete together yet, today I'm glad to confirm that we are also relaxing the rules on exercise further so that from Monday people will be able to exercise with up to 5 others from different households, crucially, so long as they remain 2 metres apart. That means that people who play team sports can train together and do things like conditioning and fitness sessions that don't involve physical contact. It's another vital and important step in the right direction. Now, we've all become a nation of early morning walkers, Wicks workouters and evening park runners, and many of us have discovered how valuable and therapeutic activity can be, and I hope that we'll continue to make time for it even as life returns to normal. We still have a way to go, but for a sporting-loving nation, today really is a significant milestone. We won't be sitting in the stands for a while, and things will be very different to what we're used to. But live sports will be back on our screens next week. The British sporting recovery has begun. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Professor Jonathan Van Tam.
Thank you, Secretary of State. I'm now going to present the daily update to you, beginning with the first slide, please. And this slide shows Google mobility data. You can see on the left of the slide the vertical dotted line, which shows when our lockdown measures started, and you can see that rapid diminution in all forms of mobility and an increase in people staying in the residential home. Over time, there have been small increases across the piece up until the end of this slide on the 21st of May, but the big difference has been in the use of parks as it has been possible to ease social distancing, and that's very clear from the data. To the right of the slide, you will see for the period 21st to the 24th of May from the Options and Lifestyle Survey of Great Britain that almost 40% of adults worked from home compared to around 12% at the same time the year before. And 98% of adults, very reassuringly, said they have continued to try to stay at least 2 metres away from other people when outside the home. Next slide, please. In terms of testing and new cases, to recap on the figures given to you by the Secretary of State, as of the 30th of May, 127,722 tests were conducted or shipped. Please remember again that some individuals, a very small proportion, may have been tested more than once. But what you can really see to the right-hand side of the top of the slide is that the level of testing is staying very steadily now in and around the 120,000 tests per day mark. In terms of confirmed cases, there were 2,445 new cases as of the 30th of May. And if you refer to the bottom graph, you will see those data arrayed in graphical form. Now, I don't want to pass away from this slide without being clear to you that I have noticed in the very tail end, the right side of the graph, some increase in cases in the last few days, but I want to be clear that that is a trend that we have seen before in these data, and what is rather more important is that you look at the 7-day rolling average, the blue line, which continues to show a clear downward trend, and that is important. Next slide, please. In terms of the data from hospitals, there have been further declines in estimated admissions with COVID-19 in England, 562, compared with 675 1 week ago. And the graph shows this continued decline. In terms of the percentage of ventilated beds occupied by COVID-19 patients, this has also continued to decline across the 4 nations and now stands at 10% compared with 12% 1 week ago. Next slide, please. These data, of course, show the total number of people in hospital with COVID-19 as opposed to the new admissions. And we are currently running at a little under 8,000 people in hospital with COVID-19, which is down from 9,400 this time last week. And with the exception of Wales, where there has been some changes to the reporting methods, you can see that there are continued declines in all other parts of the UK. Next slide, please. The final slide recaps again on the Secretary of State's announcement that as of the 30th of May, there were 215 further deaths attributed to patients with a confirmed positive COVID-19 diagnosis. The graph on the right shows the continued long-term decline with those week-on-week variations day by day. But again, importantly, the 7-day rolling average, the orange curve, continues to be downwards. And that is the update on the statistics for today. Thank you, Secretary of State.
Thank you, Professor Van Tam. So first, we will go to questions from the public, and number 1 comes from Kim from County Durham, and that's via video.
As you are starting to reopen public spaces such as beaches and parks, and are planning to reopen the shops in the near future, I would like to know when you're planning to allow more access to public toilets, many of which remain closed, to allow those individuals who have disabilities to be able to go out the same way those who are able-bodied are able to do. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your question, Kim, and I know it's a really important point that you're raising, particularly people who suffer from disabilities do need to have access to public toilets when they go out. And as soon as we are able to do so, consistent with ensuring that we can do so in a safe way in accordance with public health guidance, we will do that. And I know that my friend, the Secretary of State, the person in charge of communities, housing and local government, is looking into that as we speak. So hopefully we will be able to make progress on that. Thank you for your question. Now, question number 2 comes from Leslie from Whitstable, who sent it via text, and I'll just read that out. Why have England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland got their own track and trace systems, and how will these interact with one another to ensure you can capture everyone who may have been in contact with someone who has the virus? Well, I may ask Professor Van Tam to add a little more detail on this, Leslie, but in response to your question, it's important to understand what we're trying to do with track and trace. So essentially, as we begin to get the numbers of people with the virus under control in this country, we get smaller numbers. An important part of keeping those numbers down will be ensuring that we identify people who have the virus, so by testing them, and then we track who else they've been in contact with. That's why we've recruited 25,000 people who will do that. And then if they come across people who've been in contact with someone who has had coronavirus, they'll then ask them to self-isolate if appropriate, and that is to stop the disease spreading. We began that in earnest on Thursday and will be up and running fully from the 1st of June, so that's Monday. But in terms of the detail on the interaction, would you like to address that, Professor Van Tel?
Yes, thank you for the question. The NHS is a completely nationwide UK service for all its citizens, but it is just a case in point that the NHS is configured slightly differently across the devolved nations as it is in England. Hence the organisation NHS England as opposed to NHS UK. Now, therefore, it is logical that there are slight differences to the track and trace system as it is going to be used across the different NHS jurisdictions and the different devolved administrations of the UK. But the real point here that I want to reassure people about is that identifying cases and tracing contacts is absolutely bread and butter and business as usual for the health protection agencies of the UK. They do this as a matter of routine for tuberculosis cases, for meningitis cases, for food poisoning outbreaks. And believe me, those don't always occur. You can't say to a disease, we want you to stay this side of a border. It doesn't happen that way. And the health protection agencies of the UK are very used to working together and passing contacts and patients through as necessary. So I really have no real worries or doubts that they won't be able to cope with this in the particular COVID-19 circumstances.
Thank you. And now we go to questions from the media, and the first one comes from Chris Mason of the BBC. Chris, are you there?
Good afternoon, gents. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
I live in perpetual fear of Zoom doom. A question to you both, if I may. What do you say to those scientists and others who say that you're easing the lockdown in England too quickly?
Thank you for that question, Chris. Well, I think there's a couple of things just to note before I asked Professor Van Tam also to give his reflections. First, it's worth bearing in mind that the scientific advisory group, the government scientific advisory group, consists of more than 50 scientists, all of whom will have their different perspectives, and the government takes a collective view on the entire advice from SAGE. Secondly, I think the scientists who I've heard speak this morning are absolutely right to urge caution. We are at a risky point. That is to say that we have got the R number below 1. It's in the range of 0.7 to 0.9. But we haven't got that much headroom. That's why the Prime Minister has been clear that we need to proceed in a very cautious way. So we've set out a roadmap, but at each stage we're saying, well, we're not going to proceed with that unless we are confident that we can do so in a safe way. And indeed, if we're not confident, we'll delay measures, or indeed we may even reimpose measures. That's the whole sort of baby step path that we are going down. So I think the government is broadly in agreement with what they're saying. But Professor Van Tam, do you want to add anything?
I'll just add a few things to say that scientific opinions always vary to some extent across the piece. That's natural. SAGE, I think, has been very clear, and I am being very clear, that the easing of social distancing, the easing of lockdown, has to go slowly, it has to go painstakingly, and we have to be extremely cautious about how we do it. And the scientists will continue to give that advice to the government. No apologies for that, we will absolutely continue to do that. I believe, and you'll recall I was at the podium when the disease activity was very high in the UK, and I said it's a very dangerous moment. I believe this is also a very dangerous moment. We have to get this right. Now, the SAGE papers have been published. They're online, many of them, and it's very clear that the measures already taken to ease social distancing, SAGE have been very clear on that the chances of those easements allowing R to go above 1 are extremely low indeed. Now, the measures that have been announced to take place beginning Monday next week, SAGE again, I think, has been very clear. It has looked at a similar package of measures through the modelling and has taken a view that it is likely that with good compliance from the public and with a test and trace contact tracing system in place, that these will not either violate our going above 1. That is not an absolute guarantee that they won't, but it is a high degree of confidence, providing contact tracing goes well and providing the public adhere to the limited easement in lockdown that's taking place. And so I think there's a dual responsibility here, that contact tracing has got to go well, but the public have also got to engage with it and to take the advice about self-isolation, if it's given because you're a contact, very seriously. In terms of the advice about, for example, being able from Monday to meet 5 people outdoors, socially distanced, that's got to, again, be taken seriously, and it's got to be taken in a reasonable measure. If you go out and you meet 5 people from different households in the morning, you being the 6th person, you then go and do the same in the afternoon and the same in the evening, you can see how the number of additional contacts that are potentially possible will just rack up. So people have got to be sensible and proportionate with the freedom that, we've absolutely wanted to give to people, because we need to see loved ones. And if people go further and think, oh, it just won't matter, I'll just go a little further with the measures that have been announced, then this won't work either. This virus, as I said last time I was at the podium, has a natural R of 3. One case will infect 3 more people. It's like having a spring in a box and you've got the lid on. Now, you can take the lid off a little, but you haven't disconnected the spring or broken the spring in any way. If you take the lid right off, the spring's still under tension, off it will go again. And so this is a dual responsibility here of government to go slowly and carefully and to take the advice from the scientists, of the scientists to watch this whole thing very closely over the next few weeks, and of the public in general to actually follow the guidance. Don't tear the pants out of it, and don't go further than the guidance actually says.
Thank you. Any follow-up? Yes, go on, Chris.
Tearing the pants out of it, that's quite a phrase. Just picking up on what you've both said, do you accept that if you have to slam on the brakes or even reverse the measures that you've taken, getting people to comply then may be much trickier than it was in the earlier stages of the lockdown?
Yes, I think, in short, that is correct. That's why we have been so at pains to move with extreme caution in doing so. And it is worth noting that there's been quite a lot of sort of loose talk about the ending of the lockdown, that sort of thing. We are taking very tentative steps, principally focused around activities outside where the risk of transmission is much lower. And we are emphasising through all of this the need to maintain social distancing. So most of the pillars of this remain in place. But Professor Van Tam, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Thank you, Secretary of State. Yes, I just add a little bit of science and say here that, look, infections pass on in a moment with COVID-19, and the incubation period is 5 days typically, and so the next round of infections appears fairly quickly afterwards. In other words, this gets out of control quite quickly if you allow it to. And then, as you've seen from the previous lockdown period, it then takes many weeks to get the brakes on it. You can't slow it down as fast as you can let it go, let it take off. And that's because these cases then become problems for the healthcare system, and regrettably some of them die. And it takes a while for them to work back out through the healthcare system because they require prolonged care. And therefore, from that perspective, don't see this as a curve that's the same going up as it is down. It's quite easy to go up. It's quite hard then to get the brakes back on. And so I really hope that people will follow the advice that is given to the letter and not any further than that. And therefore, we're never in that position again.
Thank you. Now, next question is from Paul Brandt at ITV. Paul, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you. Secretary of State, You're announcing further lifting of lockdown measures today, despite the fact that some of your own scientific advisors are expressing concern. Is this government still led by science? And to Jonathan Van Tam, if I may, you mentioned just then that one of the key things is having contact tracing in place to allow these lockdown measures to be lifted. But some of your colleagues are concerned that actually the contact tracing isn't well established yet. So are we really ready, given that the contact tracing may take another couple of weeks to really kick in?
Well, thanks for your question, Paul. The first simple answer is yes, we continue to be led by the science. And indeed, I think today's guidance is an excellent example of that. I pay tribute to Professor Van Tam and others who've been involved in this. We have had extensive discussions with the sporting bodies concerned over a number of weeks, and we have come together with a package of guidance which we are confident will minimise risks. And actually, I will leave Professor Van Tam to elaborate on it. But in terms of the actual, the narrow measures of allowing the return of elite sport behind closed doors within the stadium, the impact is going to be exceptionally minimal. Of course, we need to guard against wider impacts. For example, we need to ensure that people don't congregate around stadiums and so on. And that's why I very much welcome the fact that we've got more games on free-to-air. There'll be a very important message for fans. And I think that fans will behave responsibly. I think British people have shown real good common sense throughout all of this. I'm sure they will understand the need to watch this at home, and that's an important message that we'll be getting out. So I think today's announcement is an example of us working hand in glove with the scientists. But Professor Van Tam, over to you.
Yes, thank you. So elite sports men and women are a very, very tiny but important fraction of our society. And it's very clear that playing elite sport again in those very limited circumstances with carefully controlled measures about how you get those sportsmen, sportswomen to the pitch, that is not going to have any meaningful impact on R. It would be potentially completely different if there were lots of full stadia and all of the activities that go around going to a sports game, the restaurants, the pubs, the bars, etc. But we're not in that space at the moment. And so I think the actual return of elite sport is something that will be a nice fillip to us all after the lockdown at a psychological level, but I don't think it in any way is relevant to a conversation about R. Now, in terms of the track and trace system, yes, it is new. Yes, it was announced last week. Of course, many countries are now putting these systems in place, and there will, as my Secretary of State has said, be some bedding in time required. But Baroness Harding has been very clear that the system is ready, and I think we have to move forwards on that basis.
Thank you. Any follow-up, Paul?
Yeah, if I may, just on this point about the government following the scientific advice. I mean, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland take a slightly different view to England, in particular Scotland and Wales, which have been more cautious with their lockdown lifting. So what is it about the particular circumstances in England that makes you confident that it is okay to lift the lockdown measures to a greater degree in that nation?
Well, each nation has to make its own decisions, and it's up to the Welsh and Scottish governments to explain the decisions that they have taken. In respect to the decisions that we have announced, I think three things have been influential in it. First is meeting those 5 tests which the first Secretary of State, Dominic Raab, set out a few weeks ago. The second thing that has been influential in it has been ensuring that the R, which is part of the first 5 tests, remains below 1 and gives us that headroom to be able to ease in a very cautious, careful, slow way without endangering the number spiralling above 1 and having the consequences that Professor Van Tam talked about. And the third thing is, as part of our measures, we need to ensure that we have a good track and trace system in place for the reasons that I outlined before, so that once we're aware that somebody has had or has coronavirus, ensuring that they are tested and isolated, and then people that they come into contact with take appropriate isolation measures to reduce the spread further. But Professor Van Tam, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Thank you. Only really to say that, Sir Patrick Vallance has already said it from this podium that the R is currently between 0.7 and 0.9. This means we do not have an enormous amount of headroom, and we will have to go very slowly, and we will have to go very cautiously. And this is a time where there are potential dangers if we go too fast. And I'm fully aware of those, and I'm perfectly prepared to give that advice to the government as needed.
Thank you. We now go to Lisa Holland from Sky. Afternoon, Lisa.
Good afternoon. My question is for Professor Van Tam. 8,000 new infections every day, and that's just in England, and supposedly doesn't include care homes and hospitals. Can I ask you, who is catching coronavirus and how, given that we're 10 weeks into lockdown?
And let's go straight to you, Professor Van Tam.
Right, okay, that's a difficult question. I can't tell you who's catching coronavirus. What I can tell you is the kinds of people that are at risk of catching it, and the kinds of people who are at risk of being hospitalised: the elderly, people with chronic underlying conditions, and people who are obese. That's very clear. We've also are looking very carefully for other risk factors, and the ONS has already shown that the death rate is higher in people in elementary occupations where perhaps social distancing is more difficult. And we are in the middle of a very large inquiry looking at the black and minority ethnic community. But it is, you're quite right, it's a case in point that there are 8,000 deaths, 8,000 cases occurring a day, according to ONS statistics, and we need to get to the bottom of that.
Thank you. And any follow-up?
Yeah, if I could just ask Professor again, one of your own colleagues, John Edmonds, another government advisor, scientific government advisor, had said on Sky News today, my frustration has been the government are pretending they're not making the decisions and it's us that are making the decisions, but that's not the case. That's what he says. What do you say? Do you think that is true?
Could you repeat that question, please?
Yes, we spoke to John Edmonds on Sky News today, who said, and I quote, my frustration has been the government are pretending they're not making the decisions. In other words, they're led by the science, and it's us that are making the decisions, but that's not the case at all. So in other words, do you think the government is listening to the scientific advice?
I should say just at the beginning, I know your question was addressed to President Van Tam. The government has been clear all along, the Prime Minister has been clear that ministers take responsibility for decisions but of course we take scientific advice in doing so. But I don't know whether there's anything you want to add further on that.
I think that's absolutely right. Our science advice has been so far that the social distancing that has already been eased is consistent with keeping the R below 1. The consensus of scientific advice is that the next set of measures announced for Monday, with contact tracing in place, should also keep the R within 1. Our advice is then to continue to watch this very carefully, and we will continue to give further advice to the government about whether we think it is possible to make further easements after that. And that will absolutely be a matter of advice for us and decision for the politicians.
Thank you. Move on to Ian Herbert from the Mail on Sunday. Ian.
Thanks very much. A question for you, if I could, Secretary of State. Police forces have identified yesterday 6 Premier League games which present public health concerns and require neutral venues. But clubs and fans are resisting that and insisting that their own home stadia will be safe. So if police express public health fears, should clubs and fans accept that and accept neutral venues?
Well, the short answer is yes. I mean, it is worth just understanding what we are announcing today. So the government is publishing guidelines which are setting out how elite sports can resume behind closed doors in a safe way. It is then up to each individual sport to apply those guidelines and determine the way in which they do so. In respect of where matches take place, there is a well-established mechanism through the local safety authority. The local safety authority brings together police and local authorities to determine whether it is appropriate to have a match as scheduled at a home venue or not. If that determination is made that it is not safe to do so, and clearly they have to be mindful of risks such as fans congregating, particularly if it's a crucial match and it's a home match around the stadium. If they advise that they shouldn't do it, then clearly fans should listen to that. But again, I pay tribute to fans because I think that in common with most of the British people, they've taken a sensible approach to this. They understand what we're doing. Everyone, I think most people I've spoken to, welcome the fact that if we can get live sport back again in a safe way behind closed doors, we should do so, but they understand the limitations of doing that in the current environment. Was there any... Professor Van Tam, do you want to come in?
Yeah,
sorry.
So, I'll say that the issue of fans congregating outside stadiums is clearly a police matter, and it's clearly something we would not want in the current stage of social distancing. That's absolutely clear. But beyond that, in terms of the actual staging of the game itself, the premises have to be absolutely suitable for the new conditions in which we find ourselves. This is about an end-to-end journey for the players, the officials, the media and the medical staff coming from wherever they live to take part in what is required for a game behind closed doors. And there has to be enough understanding that the venue can cope with the segregation and the organisation and the social distancing right up until the kick-off whistle. And again, exactly from the end of the final whistle, to make that the safest possible experience for everybody there. And that's going to be a crucial factor as well in choosing these venues. And I know the Premier League are all over that and thinking about it very carefully.
Thank you. Any follow-up?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your answers on that. It was interesting to hear you say, Secretary of State, that the Everton-Liverpool game will be one of the free-to-air fixtures, which is a significant gesture from Sky to give that to BBC. Is that designed to stop fans gathering at what would really be a very high-profile game, and therefore does that make it more likely that the game would be staged at Goodison Park, Everton, rather than a neutral ground? Because that was one of the 6 I referred to earlier.
Well, first of all, I should just clarify, it will be free-to-air, that not all free-to-air matches will be on BBC. Some will be on other platforms that provide free-to-air. But your point is correct nonetheless, and one of the reasons why I was pushing free-to-air broadcasting was precisely this point to discourage fans from going to first, principally other people's houses to watch these matches, but also to the stadia themselves. But I really do think in terms of the actual decision as to where a match should take place, that's not a decision that I can best take as a politician. That is a decision that is best placed taken by the local authorities and the police through the local safety authority. That is the normal way for doing it, and I trust those mechanisms. But anything else you'd like to say?
Yeah, so on the subject of fans gathering, I'm a devout Boston United season ticket holder, and I'm desperate for football to come back. But I've also talked earlier in this press briefing about sticking to the rules and not going further than the rules. And fans gathering is exactly the kind of thing that would be something which went far beyond the kind of social distancing that we need to continue to practice and the kind of small numbers that we need to stick to as of Monday. And so this is how these guidelines begin to decay at the edges, and then this will cause trouble for all of us if it happens. So I just want to be clear on that.
Thank you. Next up, we have Lucy Johnston from Sunday Express.
Hello, good afternoon. Professor Van Tam said we need a period of bedding in. before the contact system, before we know it will go well. How will people know they're having a genuine call from a contact tracer and not a scammer?
That's a very good question. First of all, I would say obviously we've made a lot of progress with this in terms of recruiting the 25,000 contact tracers, and we've done a lot of work leading up to this, covering exactly those sort of points, so people can have that reassurance. But I think, Professor Van Tam, you're probably best placed to actually talk about the mechanisms of how that would work.
Yeah. So all of that has been really carefully considered by the test and trace system. I don't have the details, but they are absolutely cited on the fact that there may be attempts to make malicious interference. But actually it would be quite difficult to do that. It would become apparent quite quickly that this was a professional talking who understood about contact tracing and the elements of it. I don't think people are going to fall for this.
Any follow-ups there, Lucy?
I was also going to ask, there are scientific estimates that potentially tens of thousands of healthy people will be asked to unnecessarily self-isolate at, of course, significant personal and economic cost after contact tracing. How can you stop this happening?
Well, I'm afraid we can't stop it happening, and this is part of the cost of track and trace. We have made a decision as a government, and I think I'll leave it to Jonathan to confirm, but based on extensive scientific advice and discussions, that this is the trade-off that we are making. We're saying that in order to help facilitate wider easing of the lockdown that will benefit everyone, it will be the case that if people have had coronavirus, been tested, and then they've been in contact with others, those people will be asked to isolate. And it will, for those people, that's not something they will particularly want to do. But I hope that the British people, and this is my sense throughout all of this, there has been this a common sense and understanding of why we're doing this. This is to benefit the wider public health, and in isolating, they are helping to ensure that we keep the R rate low and that we can continue to ease as is safe to do so. And I think that is an improvement on the very stringent lockdown measures that we had before we commenced this process. But Professor Van Tam, is there anything else?
So I'm going to go back to my spring and the fact that, the coronavirus is like a coiled spring ready to get out if we don't, and start infecting many people again if we don't keep on top of it. Now, the epidemiological principle of stopping that transmission occurring is taking people who have the infection, who are infectious, out of the system through isolation at home, and also taking out of the system temporarily people they may already have infected. Now, if you and I were contacts, in a meaningful way that Public Health England said meant that you might, I was the case, you might in the next 14 days, because that's the incubation period, develop coronavirus infection, and you may become infectious to others 1 or 2 days before your symptoms show. The only thing I can do is say to you that your risk window is for the next 14 days, and please will you isolate for the good of others. And we'll all have to take that on the chin if it happens to us, because we can't look inside people and say, well, you've definitely been exposed, and for you, your symptoms are going to appear on day X. It's just not possible. We can't even say of the people who are exposed, which ones will be the ones that go on to be the next round of cases of coronavirus infection. And so, yes, it is going to be painful for some people when they receive a notification, when PHE contact them and say, you are a definite contact of somebody who's had coronavirus infection. We need you to stay at home for the next 14 days. But as the Secretary of State clearly said, and he's absolutely right, the alternative is that we go back to stopping those contacts occurring through whole of society isolation, otherwise known as lockdown. So we either try and live with this in the best way we can and have something towards a normal life, or we have to tolerate this system with some of the difficulties it's going to bring for some people.
Thank you. And now finally to Toby Helm from The Observer.
Hello, could I ask the Secretary of State, first of all, the Prime Minister, when talking about Dominic Cummings earlier this week, said that while he wanted him to remain in post, he said that he was leaving it to the public to decide what they thought of the controversy surrounding him. A few days on, it's pretty clear what the public do think. We're running an opinion poll today which shows a very, very high majority of people believe he should be sacked. There's a petition showing more than 1 million people believe the same thing, and MPs' inboxes are groaning with complaints. So will the Prime Minister, will the government listen to the public, or will it simply ignore them? And could I ask Professor Van Tam, you say this is a very dangerous moment. So what do you say to people in authority? Should it be the people should people in authority give a lead and obey the rules above all?
Well, let me deal with your first question first, Toby. As you well know, and many viewers will know, Dominic Cummings gave a very extensive explanation of his behaviour on Monday and answered all questions in relation to that. And the Prime Minister accepted that explanation and on that basis kept him in post, and that remains the position. Professor Van Tam, anything you want to add?
Yes, thank you for the question, and I'm quite happy to answer it. In my opinion, the rules are clear, and they have always been clear. In my opinion, they are for the benefit of all, and in my opinion, they apply to all.
Any follow-up, Toby?
Just follow up to the Secretary of State. You didn't actually address the direct question, as far as I remember. I mean, is the Prime Minister, is the government actually going to listen to the public, or is it just going to ignore them?
Well, of course, the Prime Minister and the government listen to the public. In respect of Ms Dominic Cummings, this has been dealt with extensively. The Prime Minister has answered questions on it repeatedly. Dominic Cummings has answered questions repeatedly on it. I understand that people have a range of views in respect of it. It is worth noting that Durham Police have made their statement in respect of that in terms of not taking any further action. So I think that this has now been dealt with. On that note, I think we are now finished. Thank you very much. And that concludes the afternoon press briefing. Thank you.
OK, there's a lot to mull over there. Let's just remind ourselves of the main points made in today's Downing Street briefing with the Culture, Media and Sport Secretary Oliver Dowden. Domestic competitive sport is back from Monday, starting with horse racing. Other sports given the go-ahead to resume behind closed doors include football, tennis and rugby, also added to the list of sports to resume from Monday, as is cricket, snooker, golf and Formula One. Now, football will also be broadcast on terrestrial television. A third of the Premier League matches will soon be free to air. This comes as it was announced there were a further 215 deaths from COVID-19, taking the total death toll to 38,376. Mr Dowden also announced that people in England can exercise outside with up to 5 others from different households from Monday, provided that strict social distancing guidelines are followed. With me now, our health correspondent Catherine Burns. There is a lot to mull over there, and I'm just trying to establish, just on that last point, Catherine, and Professor Van Tam, in response to a question about Dominic Cummings, asked by The Telegraph, in his opinion, he said, the rules are to the benefit of all and they apply to all. And I'm just trying to get the sense, because it was quite difficult to listen in properly, but whether that was his way of saying, actually, that he agrees with public opinion over this. But I don't know. Just what was your...
What he certainly didn't say was Dominic Cummings was okay to do what he did. His statement was quite oblique. So my notes say he's quite happy to answer this, which is in contrast to some other press conferences we've seen in the last few days. The rules are clear. They have always been clear. In my opinion, they apply to all.
Yeah, interesting.
Take of that what you will.
Well, that's the political point, which surely will get picked up upon. But let's just turn to the issues of health. So many questions today, not least by some scientists on the SAGE committee saying, for them, this easing of lockdown is coming too soon. They are not comfortable with it. So in terms of what we've just heard, do we think that their fears are going to be allayed?
So it was an interesting one. So Oliver Dowden was very, very clear to say, the ministers, we do follow science, but we take responsibility for our own actions. He was saying, the scientists are right to be concerned, but we're taking baby steps, was his phrase. And if it's not safe, we will not proceed. And we may even go back and reimpose different measures. And he also pointed out that SAGE, which is the scientists committee that advises the government, he says there's more than 50 people on that. And yes, there will be different perspectives. Now, obviously, throughout the day, we've heard from some of those scientists saying we're not happy, we think this is too soon. So it was very interesting to see what Jonathan Van Tam had to say about it, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer. Now, he was interesting. He said, look, it is natural that there will be a lot of different opinions, and this has to go painstakingly slowly. And he said the scientists will continue to give the government that advice. However, he did say the measures that have been announced, he says the general consensus is that they will keep that all-important R rate below 1. The point is that once it gets beyond 1, then the virus is going to start to grow exponentially. So he said, but he was very interesting in the way that he kind of put it as a dual responsibility on us, the public, and also the government themselves. So he said for the public, yes, in England, for example, you are allowed to go out and meet 5 other people. But if you meet 5 in the morning, 5 in the afternoon, 5 in the evening, then obviously the number of contacts is going to rack up and up. So he said, don't tear the pants out of this policy, which is a good turn of phrase there. But he also was very strong on the fact that this will only work if the test and tracing system is up and running. He made that point over. And he said we have to go very slowly and very cautiously. There are potential dangers if we go too fast. And the scientists, he said, will keep giving the government that advice. Yes, so he was towing an interesting line there.
He did. And I mean, to quote him, Britain is at a very dangerous moment as it starts to ease some of its lockdown measures. And as you say, very much dependent, he was clear, it depends on compliance from the public, but also on the contact tracing, the testing and tracing. So where are we with that? Because there are many questions.
We are early days in. I have been trying to get some figures from the government on how many contacts have been traced. That data is not available at this stage. What I've also been doing is speaking to a contact tracer and some of their network. So this particular person I've spoken to has done 2 4-hour shifts. In that time, they were given 1 contact to trace and they left a voicemail. That was it. And they said that other of their colleagues are finding the same kind of experiences. They showed me some messages today saying, I've been sitting here for 2.5 hours, I haven't got a contact to trace, been sitting here all morning, nothing to do. At the same time, though, they say, actually, that's been the sense from the beginning. We're only a couple of days in, and actually they feel that the numbers are starting to pick up. So it's one to watch and wait and see what happens.
Well, let's look at some of the other headlines. There was a question to ask, why have we got 8,000 new infections every day in England? Who is catching the virus and how, given that everybody should be under such a strict lockdown
We've
still?
been in lockdown now for 10 weeks, essentially. There wasn't really a very clear answer to that. What we were told instead is who's at risk if they get this. But we weren't told who is getting this virus right now, which is a question that all of us need to know, because it is really important to say, we're at the position right now, 8,000 new cases a day. They think that the R number is just below 1, between 0.7 and 0.9. This is after lockdown. We've been shut down now for almost 10 weeks. So who knows what's going to happen in the next few weeks. But Jonathan Van Tam did feel that these measures are not going to boost this above 1.
What were your other headlines from what you've heard?
Well, the interesting thing was the sport that's going to open up. So they were saying, we're going to grassroots sports open again. But social distancing, everything must be painstaking. We're not going to be seeing contact sport happen. People are not going to be out playing with their friends in that way. That was, I found very interesting. Saying as a sport-loving nation, live sport will be back next week. So obviously people are going to be very pleased about that. But really the focus for me was on this divide between the easing up that we're having and the statements we're having from the scientists, which is something I've been looking at all day. I've been ringing round, checking the Twitter of various scientists on both SAGE and the subcommittees. And the picture has mainly been, I have to say, of the ones I've managed to speak to, obviously a lot of them do not really want to speak to the press, a picture of concern. You know, they're saying, some are saying things like, we're easing a lot of things at the same time, and maybe it would have been better to ease one, see what impact that has. A few weeks later, ease another. But one scientist has actually, who doesn't want to be named, just spoken to my colleague in the last half an hour, says that there's a real concern that scientists don't want to be seen to be calling for more lockdown. And they've said maybe instead of sort of locking down, we need to have more specific measures, for example, measures around care homes. So the one person we've managed to speak to who wants this to continue didn't want to be named.
Catherine, now thank you very much indeed. Well, you spoke about sports. Let's go to our sports correspondent, John Watson at the BBC Sports Centre. And let's just get a take from you then in terms of what you have heard with regards to sport. What is this going to do?
Yes, Kate, well, just to follow on from what you were talking about there, we understand that as from Monday, competitive sport will be allowed to resume in England. Centre. We know that there's a full fixture list of races planned for Newcastle Racecourse on Monday morning. There's going to be 10 races there, 12 horses running in each. We know that the sport has been planning for a return behind closed doors for a number of weeks now. And as far as racing is concerned, it means that the biggest sporting event to be staged since the easing of lockdown restrictions is likely to be the 2000 Guineas, which will be run at Newmarket on the 6th of June. We know that Ascot as well, Royal Ascot, planning to stage races behind closed doors later on in the summer. So horse racing really will be front and centre as competitive sport returns next week. Now, it must be pointed and phrased that all of this takes place amid the backdrop of strict government guidelines. Oliver Dowden outlining that today, saying that elite athletes must still maintain social distancing guidelines where possible, which, as we know, with competitive sport and contact sport, that's not going to be easy. So with the return of contact sport, it is down to the governing bodies and leagues and clubs to ensure that rigorous testing is in place so that elite sportsmen and women can be tested for the virus. So essentially what that does is place the decision on when individual sports, respective sports, can return in the hands of the governing bodies, of the leagues and of the clubs, to ensure that they feel, when they feel the best and safest time to return is amid the backdrop of those strict government guidelines. We know that the Premier League plan to return on the 17th of June. We know that the 20 Premier League clubs still have to vote on that. That, of course, has dominated the conversation with regards to sport and when we might see the return of sport. But I guess as well, if you think that we're going to see a return of mainstream sport ushered in entirely, it's worth pointing out that rugby union hasn't even set a date yet to return to contact training, let alone playing competitive fixtures. So I think we're some way short of that. We know that the government, of course, this is the latest advice coming today as part of their sort of three-step strategy. We know that that was revised as well back on the 25th of May when the government allowed elite sportsmen and women to return to contact training. So interesting that even though rugby union is allowed to return to training, as yet they haven't done so. So of course we're all looking to the Premier League. That, as I say, should be set to return on the 17th of June, but horse racing will return with that full calendar at Newcastle on Monday. But certainly a very significant announcement nonetheless today with the return of competitive sport for the first time in what has been some 3 months.
Indeed, so very welcome news, I'm sure, for a lot of fans, John. Just specifically on racing, how is this going to play, given it's behind closed doors, for those who are so dependent on the sport, particularly racing, the bookies not least? How is it going to play out, do you think?
Well, we know that there'll be no bookmakers at the course. We know that there's going to be no fans, no spectators. But again, it is all about the sport adhering to these strict government guidelines. And interesting to note that at Newcastle Racecourse, they're going to be introducing a one-way system for jockeys to gain access to the premises and when leaving as well. So there's a very clear plan in place to still try to adhere to the social distancing guidelines. We know that the jockey room, which is always a very packed and rather tight place, isn't it, where the jockeys are always rubbing shoulders with each other. They've enlarge the room somewhat there so that jockeys can still try and attempt to stay 2 metres apart to adhere to those government guidelines. So obviously, as far as racing is concerned, as I say, they've been planning for a number of weeks now to try and implement a return behind closed doors, and with those checks in place to still try and adhere to those guidelines, they feel that the safety of all of those involved, the trainers and the jockeys, the owners as well, worth pointing out, they won't be allowed inside those racing venues. But as far as adhering to those guidelines are concerned, I think horse racing feels that they are able to do that behind closed doors and obviously ensure the safety of all of those involved, while of course not placing any additional impact on the wider society as well.
John, for now, thank you. John Watson there. Well, let's stay with that theme of the racing then, because Lee Mottershead joins us. He's the senior writer on the Racing Post. Just following on from what John was saying, really welcome news to begin with for the industry.
Yeah, it's fantastic news. The British Horse Racing Authority that governs the sport here has been working very closely with government and Whitehall over recent weeks and months, trying to bring the sport back, but only at a time when government felt it was right to do so in conjunction with other sports. So it's great news that the sport is coming back. It's not just a sport, it's an industry. It's one that contributes around £4 billion every year into the economy. There are 20,000 jobs directly connected to horse racing. So for those people, it's very important that racing comes back. I think it's important to the society because it was being a sport, it's a form of entertainment. And now more than ever before, people need to be entertained.
Yes, they will. But what impact do you think it will have, given that obviously there's nothing like the real thing? So given that it's all going to be behind closed doors?
Well, it will be behind closed doors, but it will be the real thing. For those who are watching the action, and that will be on television, the horse racing will look exactly as it always has done. If people are watching the 2000 Guineas 7 days from now, or Royal Ascot, or the Derby on the first Saturday in July, what they see is the action that takes place on the track, and that action won't look any different. For those who are on the racecourse, it will be very different, but only people who are absolutely essential to staging a race meeting will be on those tracks. Those people will have to have their temperature taken when they get to the track. They'll have to confirm that they're of good health at the time. And the provisions are very, very strict, to the extent that if a horse box arrives and the driver or anyone else in that horse box gives a temperature reading above the norm, they will have to leave and the horse can't run. It's a really strict set of protocols, but they're essential for getting the sport back going again.
You mentioned the finances, of course, and what the industry brings to the economy. What financial impact has this had?
Well, it's very difficult to say because there's so many different diverse groups in racing, but I think you can give a pretty good estimate of around £50 million lost to the industry since mid-March when racing stopped. And of course, the longer racing goes on, the harder that would be. And really, there's a lot of gratitude in racing to those owners who have kept their horses in stables instead of sending them off to their summer holidays out in lush green fields. That's meant that horses are able to race as soon as racing resumes. It's kept trainers in jobs. It's kept the grooms who work for trainers in jobs. The ones who've been hardest hit really at the moment are jockeys who haven't been able to take rides and racecourses who've had no income. So they will be extremely pleased that from Monday at Newcastle, we can get going again.
Lovely. Lee, thank you so much for joining us. Much appreciated. Now we're joined by former Government Chief Scientific Officer Sir David King, head of the independent SAGE Group. Now, the group was established to look at how the UK could work its way out of the lockdown after the government's official panel of scientific advisors, SAGE, faced criticism over a perceived lack of transparency. So you, of course, are looking with an extremely keen eye and an extremely critical eye. What do you make of what you've heard in today's press briefing?
Well, I think it is too much too quickly. That's the general view. We should not be moving on loosening up the lockdown until the test, track, and isolate capability has actually been developed. We're just rushing into this to open it on the 1st of June before we know that it's all operating at scale. And if it's not operating at scale, if it's operating, with a small number of people, that's really not going to be good enough. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is we know that schools are also reopening on the 1st of June, or so the government would like to see. But there's not been, in addition to the test, track, and isolate policy coming into play, there hasn't been a good communication with local communities. Clearly, the local community has schools in those local communities. That is where the final decision has to be reached. We don't have from the government the details on what the infectivity rate is in local populations, but what we are fully aware of is that the infectivity rate varies considerably from one community to another. Even in one city like London or Birmingham, there are areas where the R factor is quite high, very close to 1, and other areas where it's quite low. But really, the question is, what is the infectivity rate? I mean, my concern, looking at the data, is that the curves that Professor Van Tam showed indicate that while the public has done such a wonderful job in the lockdown, while we've brought the infectivity rate down very significantly, we still haven't quite reached the point where we went into lockdown. So as we move forward, wouldn't you think at least that we would go beyond the point where we decided it was serious enough to go into lockdown? So I think we're moving too quickly. We have to surely be patient because we've put 3 months' effort into this, we, the British public, and to suddenly lift it on the 1st of June because that date has been chosen a little while ago seems to me just rushing into the possibility of a second wave of the epidemic emerging. I think what is interesting as well, travellers into the United Kingdom have not been quarantined. We're one of the very few countries in Europe that has taken that line. In other parts of Europe, we see that everyone has to go into quarantine for 14 days for many months now. But we're not even introducing that until June the 7th. So I think we really need to be much more aware of the fact that we can lose so much by going into this opening up too quickly. And when I say that, I fully understand that what we need to do is get over this epidemic as quickly as possible with the least number of further deaths. That is also going to get us back into a functioning economy where we can work again.
And on that, Sir David, you will know more than most, working within government when you did, the pressures on the government right now in terms of the fears over the economy, in terms of those people who are saying we cannot sustain this, the self-employed, the small business owners, the economy as a whole. You will understand the pressures and the balance that the government has to make at this very moment.
I fully understand that, and I also fully understand, because we've had a lot of communications from parents of school children, that they are also keen to get their children back into school. I do understand all of that. But what I'm saying is that we mustn't lose all the advantage we've had. Otherwise, we get back into square one and off we go on a second wave. And then it's another 3 months before we're out of it. So I think I'm just feeling we should be more cautious, we should be more patient, and really ask businesses to understand we will not manage to get back into full functional businesses in the UK until we have managed to get this epidemic virtually over with. We're nowhere near our neighbours in Europe, and that's for 2 reasons. One, the epidemic came to Britain after many of our mainland neighbours, but at the same time, we were slower than every one of them in reaching lockdown. So in our case, the number of infected people in the country is much larger. The number of fatalities per head of population is now probably the largest in the world. So we've come into it too late. If only our business colleagues had been pushing government to say, get into the lockdown quickly, get this over quickly with as few fatalities as possible, and we can get back to business. There is my example of Greece, where Greece went into lockdown well before any other European country, when they only had 3 cases and they didn't have a single death. They started talking about how to get into lockdown, and they have emerged with 170 deaths. We have that many still per day, or more than that per day. And they have done it absolutely by the instructions, if you like, of the WHO. The question would be, when we follow those instructions and also get it over with quickly. But I think we are where we are. We must not rush. Otherwise, we're going to find it'll be much, much worse for all of us.
Okay, I wish we had more time, but sadly we don't. So David King, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your thoughts. Thank you. OK, well, let's remind you then of the announcement made by the Culture, Media and Sports Secretary Oliver Dowden giving today's coronavirus briefing from Downing Street.
Now, for more than 2 months after sport stopped, and after weeks of round-the-clock discussions with medical experts and professional sports bodies, I'm delighted to announce today that the government has published guidance which allows competitive sport to resume behind closed doors from Monday at the earliest, and crucially, only when it's safe to do so. It's up to each individual sport to decide exactly when to resume competition. They know their sports best. But football, tennis, horse racing, Formula One, cricket, golf, rugby, snooker and others are all set to return to our screens shortly, with horse racing first out of the gate in the North East next week. It's been a huge challenge to get to this point. We've taken a forensic, clinician-led approach, working with Public Health England and the Department of Health every step along the way. And we've had dozens of meetings and published pages of detailed guidance outlining first how to get athletes back into socially distanced training and then back into close contact training. And throughout all of this, we've put the safety of the athletes, coaches and support staff first and foremost. And by working so closely with the sports themselves, we've made sure that it's been a collaborative, consensual effort to create the safest possible environments for everyone involved. Now, the guidance outlines various measures that need to be in place for an event to go ahead and to keep everyone involved safe. That includes a screening process for coronavirus symptoms at the venue, a one-way system for people and vehicles, minimising the use of dressing rooms and, of course, maintaining social distancing wherever that is possible.
OK, well, let's pick up on some of that with the Shadow Health Minister, Justin Madders. Your response to what you've heard in today's briefing?
Well, I think what we heard from Professor Van Tam about the Dominic Cummings saga was particularly revealing. He would agree that everyone should be obeying the rules correctly and that they apply to everyone. And the fact that he was at pains throughout the broadcast to talk about how important it is that people comply with the rules moving forward says to me that there is still an issue with the underlying concerns about the public message that the Prime Minister on this issue has led to. And we know as well that there are significant concerns from a number of the scientists advising the government about whether the lockdown is coming too soon. And I'm not sure we really got any satisfactory answers on those today.
And in terms of the confidence of Professor Van Tam, who was at great pains to stress that, as he put it, Britain is at a very dangerous moment as it starts to ease some of its lockdown measures. He spoke about the need for compliance from the public, but also about the success of contact tracing.
Yes, and I think that is something that we have significant concerns about. We know, for example, that these tracers that have been recruited are often sitting around not doing anything because the system doesn't seem to be working properly. We know that they don't feel that they've been adequately trained. We know there are still issues with the tests that are being done by the government. They don't actually know anymore how many people they're testing each day. We know people are still having to travel too far away to get those tests. We know the turnaround times are an issue. And we also know that the accuracy of these tests is also of concern. And of course, we don't actually have the app yet. And that was what the Prime Minister and Matt Hancock said was going to be the big thing, the big difference, the big game changer with this new system was the app. So it doesn't seem to me that we've got anything quite right already in terms of a testing and tracing system. And that is absolutely vital if we're going to see any further relaxation.
There was that balancing that Professor Van Tam also referred to in terms of, and he said, either we try to live with this the best way we can or tolerate with some difficulties, referring to those who may be contacted, you know, your comments there taken on board. But there is this sense now, and I'm sure you can understand, for a government that is trying to balance this with getting the economy back on track, given the warnings that we've had as a nation, this is there are almighty difficulties for a government in terms of making decisions. But one does have to wonder about some dissent now in terms of those scientists who say they're not comfortable, but the government may be making decisions that are maybe more political. But can you understand that, at least, in terms of the decisions that are having to be made? There are balances that have to be made now.
Well, look, everyone wants the lockdown to end. Everyone wants to be able to see their friends and family again and give them a hug. But we also know that we can't take any chances with this. I think we've heard today that the number of hospital admissions has gone up. The number of new cases has been going up for a couple of days as well. And I think both the Culture Secretary and the Professor said that we are at a very, very risky moment. So I think the concern we've got is actually we may be taking too many steps too soon. And what we don't want and what will be extremely difficult to really get back on track again is if we go out of this too quickly and finding the second wave is even worse than the first. So I absolutely understand the pressures on government. I absolutely understand why they want things to return to normal. And of course, we all want that. But the worst thing we can do is come out of lockdown too quickly and risk a second wave.
Shadow Health Minister Justin Mathers, thanks for joining us. Thank you. Police forces in England have warned the public not to break the rules this weekend, to wait until Monday. Groups, but will people heed the warning? And are they? Anne-Marie Tasker reports from York.
A hot day on the riverbank in York, tempting families and housemates outside. From Monday, the rules relax, and in England, up to 6 people can meet outside. But those enjoying today's sunshine think some are reluctant to wait.
It's quite difficult to give people an opportunity but then tell them they need to wait for 72 hours or so, because obviously people's opinion will be, what is the difference in the infectious disease spread between now and Monday?
Meeting up with friends and maintaining a safe distance and using your common sense. I think as long as you use your common sense, I don't know why it's a huge problem.
Tourists have been replaced by locals, and with pubs and beer gardens shut, people queue for takeaways. Businesses here say even ahead of Monday's changes, people are coming out in bigger groups.
People have been allowed to come out for takeaway now for the last, since lockdown. So the river's still been pretty busy, even individuals or a couple of people. They're getting a coffee or a drink or a bottle of water or whatever, and there are no toilets. So right now, that's essential. You've got groups meeting now in sixes, having a pint, having a gin, having a coffee, nowhere to go. And then the other one is bins. Again, because everywhere is predominantly takeaway, there are nowhere near enough bins.
Police forces have urged the public not to jump the gun and break the rules this weekend. But not everyone is keeping this socially distant. Anne-Marie Tasker, BBC News, York.
Now, from Monday, many primary schools in England will open more widely for some year groups. There's been opposition, though, from teaching unions and some local authorities concerned about the risks of spreading coronavirus. The government, however, says it is safe for children to go back. It's used Denmark as an example as the first country in Europe to reopen schools and daycare centres. And according to official data, that hasn't led to an increase of infections. Our education correspondent Elaine Dunkley reports.
Can schools in England mirror what has happened in Denmark? 6-year-old Hannah has been back in her class in the Danish capital, Copenhagen, since mid-April. Hannah now learns and plays with just a small group of children. Nearly all of her classmates have returned, and the infection rate for coronavirus in Denmark is currently falling. Meet Hannah's parents, Jens Christian and Louise. And in England...
Hello, I'm Kate in Liverpool. I have 2 boys.
Hi, my name is Marvin Harrison. I'm based in London and I have 2 children.
Can the Danish experience convince these parents who are sceptical about schools in England partially reopening from Monday?
Sort of every Monday they start all over again by reminding them, okay, remember distancing, remember washing your hands. And even the 6-year-olds are pretty good at quote-unquote self-policing these things, because they also want to do the right thing.
If the death rate was higher in your country, would that have changed your approach and how you felt about going back to school at that time?
I think we had the sense that a lot of the efforts that were made had an effect, although they sound really, really basic, that some of the simple guidance in terms of washing hands and keeping distance and so on had actually worked. I think maybe if we had someone at particular risk in our family or in our household, we would have been more anxious about sending Hannah back to school.
That is very much my situation. My 11-year-old is shielding, so he is in the extremely vulnerable category. So he will not be returning to school. But then I have my other little boy who is in year 1, he's nearly 6. And I have a real concern that unless the school could guarantee us that he could maintain strict social distancing, he places his brother at risk by bringing something into the house.
Have you heard anything from Denmark that would reassure you? Or is there anything that you think we could learn from Denmark?
My personal concerns is that we have seen more Black people die from COVID-19. At this point, the risks are way too great. And so we're just going to have to take a view stronger than what's being said and really just protect our families.
Schools in Wales will not reopen on the 1st of June, and schools in Scotland and Northern Ireland are due to start in August. It's home time in Denmark, but going back to school in England is a personal and difficult decision for many parents. Creating confidence in the new school rules is crucial in getting children back in the classroom. Elaine Dunkley, BBC News.
Let's get the view of Dr. Mary Bowstead, the Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union, who called for the government to draw back from reopening primary schools in England from Monday. It's a little late for that, though, don't you think?
Well, to be fair, we've been calling for that for quite some time. But after the evidence today that now 5 members of the government's SAGE Scientific Committee said we're easing the lockdown too quickly, and in particular 2 of them mentioned the particular issues with schools and easing the lockdown, saying that unless there's a properly running test, trace and isolate in place, and that unless the incidence of infection is down, and in particular until we know more about how and to what extent children transmit the virus back into their families, back into their community, within the school, then it is not safe for schools to open.
And you're not reassured by the official data that we've just been hearing about in Denmark that shows reopening did not worsen the outbreak, and similar findings for Finland too?
Well, I was speaking to the Vice President of the Danish Teachers Union last week. In fact, I've done a recorded interview with her, and there are huge differences. Denmark went into lockdown much earlier. It had a much, much lower incidence of infection in the community. When the schools went back, there was very strict social distancing. Their class sizes are much smaller. There was a lot of money put in for washing facilities, for sanitizers, and there was an agreement between the teachers and the government about exactly what needed to be in place. Even strict social distancing with reception and with the youngest children. But in Denmark, the youngest children start school at 7. We're asking 4- and 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds to go back, and they have no concept of social distancing. So I think it's really dangerous to make comparisons when really how Denmark approached it and how England approaching it are very different things.
Although, well, firstly, I have seen some risk assessments that schools have been asked to undertake and have been really applying those stringent principles. I must ask you, though, about children's mental health. There is a grave concern among many, many parents who say, look, can we please put mental health of equal value to physical health here, and really desperate to see their children back into some form of routine. What would you say to them, and indeed those children who are suffering right now?
So I would say that both the SAGE advisors now and the independent SAGE, who have been critical, you were interviewing Sir David King, critical of the government, say give it 2 weeks. In 2 weeks' time, if you stay with the lockdown, the infection rate will have halved, the chance of children getting the virus will have halved, the chance of them passing it on will have halved. Now, I can see why 2 weeks seems like a long time, But actually, if that means that children are much less likely to get the virus, much less likely to pass it on, and are able to come back to school in a much safer way, then I think that is better for all concerned. Because the worst thing that could happen is if we have to go back to school and then stop that because there's a second wave. And the level of concern about a second wave is now really very high.
Dr. Mary Bowser, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. Now, private tenants are more likely to be in financial difficulty than homeowners because of the pandemic, according to a new study. The report says many renters have seen their incomes fall. Our business correspondent Katie Austin explains.
Paying nearly £2,000 a month rent on her family home has become too much for Denny, while her husband's out of work and her hair salon is shut. Her landlord has agreed to postpone 2 months' rent to be paid back in future.
At the moment we owe April and May, and then June is due the 1st of June. I feel sick, actually, because at the moment now that's obviously one of our biggest outgoings for rent.
Citizens Advice estimates that around 2.6 million tenants expect to fall behind on their rent because of coronavirus. And the Resolution Foundation says 1 in 5 private renters have been furloughed or lost their jobs since the crisis began, with 1 in 4 reducing other spending to cope with meeting their housing costs. The think tank says renters seem to be struggling with payments more than homeowners.
Going into the crisis, they were in a weaker financial position than homeowners. They had lower levels of savings, for example, and critically, they also spent considerably more of their income on housing costs in the first place. But it's also fair to say that homeowners have been more successful at directly reducing their housing costs.
The government has brought in measures to try and help struggling tenants. In March, evictions were banned for 3 months. But a committee of MPs has warned a crisis is looming in the private rental sector. Citizens Advice is concerned about what happens after the eviction ban ends in late June.
What we want the government to do is make sure that there's protections for people who've fallen into arrears due to coronavirus, and then also take steps to make sure landlords have to put in place things like affordable repayment plans and make sure that the requirement that the government have given to landlords to work with renters has some teeth.
One landlords group says its members are working out solutions with tenants wherever possible, but that can't be sustained forever, nor can the eviction ban.
A number of our members are having issues with regards to issues that arose pre-COVID and not able to get possession of their property. A careful reopening of evictions needs to take place that prioritises pre-COVID debt, that prioritises antisocial behaviour and prioritises domestic violence.
The ministry responsible for housing said it is keeping its support for renters and landlords during the pandemic under review and said strengthening welfare is also helping prevent financial hardship. Denny is just hoping her family income picks up again soon to avoid falling further into arrears. Katie Austin, BBC News.
Now let's remind you of the announcement then made by the Culture, Media and Sports Secretary today, Oliver Dowden, giving the coronavirus briefing from Downing Street.
Now, for more than 2 months after sport stopped and after weeks of round-the-clock discussions with medical experts and professional sports bodies, I'm delighted to announce today that the government has published guidance which allows competitive sport to resume behind closed doors from Monday at the earliest, and crucially, only when it's safe to do so. It's up to each individual sport to decide exactly when to resume competition. They know their sports best. But football, tennis, horse racing, Formula One, cricket, golf, rugby, snooker and others are all set to return to our screens shortly, with horse racing first out of the gate in the North East next week. It's been a huge challenge to get to this point. We've taken a forensic, clinician-led approach, working with Public Health England and the Department of Health every step along the way. And we've had dozens of meetings and published pages of detailed guidance outlining first how to get athletes back into socially distanced training and then back into close contact training. And throughout all of this, we've put the safety of the athletes, coaches and support staff first and foremost. And by working so closely with the sports themselves, we've made sure that it's been a collaborative, consensual effort to create the safest possible environments for everyone involved. Now, the guidance outlines various measures that need to be in place for an event to go ahead and to keep everyone involved safe. That includes a screening process for coronavirus symptoms at the venue, a one-way system for people and vehicles, minimising the use of dressing rooms and, of course, maintaining social distancing wherever that is possible.
Now, one of the most recognisable buildings in the world, the Leaning Tower of Pisa, is one of the tourist attractions in Italy being allowed to reopen today after an easing of coronavirus restrictions. Numbers will be limited to 15 at a time. All visitors will be provided with an electronic device which goes off if someone breaches social distancing rules. Much more on that to come. You are watching BBC News. Coming up next, the BBC News Tea Time.